Our first speaker is Dr. Bruce Winders. He is the historian and curator of the Alamo, and we just wanted him to give you a quick introduction of the Alamo. What is it historically? Dr. Bruce Winders got his doctorate at TCU out of Fort Worth. He has been at the Alamo since 1996 in the newly created position of historian and curator. A recognized authority on the conflicts between the United States, Mexico, and Texas, Dr. Winders is the author of several books, including Mr. Polk's Army, Crisis in the Southwest, Sacrificed at the Alamo, and his newest one, Panting for Glory. A former classroom teacher and public historian, Dr. Winders maintains a keen interest in education and educators, and he's very enthusiastic about it all, and a good friend of mine. Those who know him can readily attest to his passion and skill as an educator of students of all ages. Please welcome Dr. Winders.
Good morning. I'm going to start off with, we're going to talk about the Alamo, but first I'm going to talk about me. And when I'm talking about me, I'm probably talking about experiences that we've had together. I've always had an awareness of history. And even as my earliest memories, there's this idea that there's this thing called history. And part of it is the family that I grew up in, but it's also the time that I grew up in. I was born in 1953, so I think I'm 62 or something like that. But it allowed me to grow up in really it's kind of a special time in the United States. And I grew up surrounded by a traditional version of history, which of course is going to include the Alamo. Now, being born in 1953, I was too young when Fess Parker came out on television, but I had this family friend who was much older than I was at that time. You know, he was kind of ancient. He was probably about 8 years old. And he told me, about this mythical person called Davy Crockett and this place called the Alamo. And so it was right when I was becoming aware of the world around me, and that's what I was being introduced to, is Davy Crockett and the Alamo. So I probably share that with some of you, having grown up in that era, having those same sort of early perceptions of history and how I got into the field of history. As I got older, I'd like to say as I matured, but I'm not sure I did. As I got older, there was a time where I was a public school teacher, and I did that for 10 years. And I taught Texas history, U.S. history, world geography. I think that's pretty much it. But I did that to support my other life, which was being a Civil War reenactor, which, for those of us who were involved in it at that time, it was really a semi-pro sport. You did things so that you could buy your gear and go places, but it was much more than a hobby. It was kind of a lifestyle. It was kind of like a cult. And I didn't really realize that until I got out, and I was like, oh, I've been in a cult for all this time. But I was doing this when the 150th anniversary of Texas independence, the sesquicentennial, came along. And so those of us that were doing Civil War, we also said, hey, let's do this thing called the Texas Revolution. And I'd always liked the Texas Revolution, again, going back to my 8-year-old friend and my upbringing. But now it was, well, let's do the Texas Revolution. Some of you know somebody who passed away back in 2012, Kevin Young, got many of us into it. But we did the sesquicentennial events, and then some of us did the IMAX film. So I can go several steps away and watch this home movie called the Alamo Price of Freedom, and I'm going, oh, that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so. And I have people that'll say, oh, you were in it, can I see you? And it's like, what I will tell them is, yeah, I'm the one with the beard. Knowing that there's 500 other people with beards, so it's sort of my joke on them. But we did that. Now, at the same time, I was going to graduate school, working on a master's, and one of the topics that I was doing was the Texas Revolution because it fit in with my interest and my semi-professional sport aspect. And I wrote one paper out of several papers, but it was entered into a history graduate student essay contest, and it won. And I got $500 for it. And now I look back at it and I think, well, if this one won, I sure would hate to see what the others was. But it did several things. It said, hey, you could possibly do this. And so I went from a master's to pursuing a PhD in not Texas history, not Civil War, but something in between them, and that's the war with Mexico. And what I'd like to tell people is that I've written some of the best books on the Mexican War that you will never read. And that's because the field of Mexican War studies doesn't really exist because it falls in between other things. This has really kind of worked to my benefit because it allows me to go back in time and it allows me to go forward in time. I got my doctorate, and then it's one of those odd things where if you look at life sort of as things flying through the air and sometimes they meet, I needed a job. And the Alamo had this opening for a historian and curator. And we met. And so that's how I came to be at the Alamo. Now, that was in 96. And it was at the end of another sesquicentennial. That was the sesquicentennial, or the beginning of a sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the war with Mexico. Now, Texas independence, 150 years, had been over for about 10 years. But in 96 and in the years since then, what I've been able to do is look back and go, that 96 or that 86 period really was important. And it was important because it marked a turning point. Now, some of you remember in 86, it was kind of a clash of cultures where it was, we want to celebrate. We want to, all the heroics. We want to honor our heroes. But at the same time, it was, well, no, we need to look at these people again, and we need to include more. And so it was really not necessarily a contentious time, but it showed that something was getting ready to happen. And what that was that other people became interested in this time period, and they began to write. And so it produced a great wealth of information, which I'm going to show you a PowerPoint in a second. But with this questioning of the traditional interpretation, the interpretation that I grew up with, probably the interpretation that you grew up with, it produced much more information, and very much like the maps that you saw, they were in pieces, separate pieces, and then when they were treated, they became clearer. That's what's been happening since '86 with the interpretation of the Texas Revolution. Things are being put together that weren't necessarily thought to be related, and you're getting a clearer picture of what's happening. And so, my PowerPoint, am I supposed to do that, or? Yeah, I'm picking this up, and I'm pushing which button?
Forward, backwards. And there's a laser pointer, but that's complicated.
All right. So I first have to say, if you see any misspelled words, I am I'm a chronic misspeller. And it's not that I set out to be, but I've mastered that art. There's a story I could tell you about the 5th grade, but I'll save that. All right, so I'm going to push a button. Okay, the Alamo of our youth. So what we're talking about is, these are the things that many of us grew up with. Lon Tinkle's book, 1958. I remember being in the 8th grade and ordering that from a Scholastic readers. And, that was the book that I ordered, Lon Tinkle, 13 Days to Glory. At that time, I'd probably also read Walter Lord. But these are sort of the classics that mark out that traditional version that many of us grew up with. Now, in the pre-sesquicentennial, there are important things that are happening. One is you get the papers of the Texas Revolution, which are critical to people who are doing studies on the Texas Revolution. So that's in 73. You've got, I never can know if I'm saying his name right because he died too soon, but Hobart Hewson, extremely important. You get Carmen Perry's with Texas, so the De La Pena, but you've got all these things that are starting to come out prior to the Texas Revolution. Dan Kilgore, how did Davy die? So the questioning of Crockett's. David Weber's The Mexican Frontier. So this is right on the eve of the Texas sesquicentennial. And so this is the sesquicentennial. You get a very influential exhibit and book that come out of SMU. You get the beginning of sort of solidifying what Amelia Williams had done when you have Bill Groneman, Phil Rosenthal doing the Roll Call at the Alamo, which will later turn into Alamo Defenders. You get movies, but you also get something by Stan Green, The Mexican Republic, which is extremely important. And if you haven't read that, you need to. Paul Hutton edits a version of The Life of Davy Crockett. Alamo, The Price of Freedom. Also, not up here, this is the time where you get the formation of the Alamo Society and the Alamo Journal. Paula Mitchell Marks. Now notice that the letters get smaller. And that's because I'm using this as a graphic to not necessarily for you to read everything, but you to get the idea that the amount of books coming out during this time period increases dramatically. And so in that 95 to 96 period, you get, again, some of the things that we look back at on foundation books in this new age of interpretation of the Alamo and the Texas Revolution. 96 to 99, again, all these books that are coming out. So if you can go back to that first slide from the 50s, the letters are pretty big, not a lot of entries on it. And again, as you go forward in time, many more people writing, people that are advocational historians, you get academics beginning to come in that are writing, but some very important books that we still look at today. New millennium, again, take a look at all these things that have been produced. You know, it doesn't, you know, the year 2000, so what, 16 years ago? But all these things have come out. New millennium, the second slide, you know, it hasn't slowed down. And the topics that are being discussed in these new works, remember at the point where you said the Alamo, and to most people it was Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, Travis. It's not that way anymore. And one reason is because William C. Davis came out with a book called 3 Roads to the Alamo that pretty much put an exclamation point on who those people were. And so you've got people going off into the Mexican army, Mexican politics, issue of slavery, women's history. And so it's becoming much more, I should say, a broader range of topics, and also geographically starting to spread across North America and really the world. I think this is the last slide, but 2010 to 2016, you know, you have 2 of the authors that are going to speak today, Andrew Torgett and Lee Spencer White on Joe. So the purpose of showing you this is that we get this idea that the Alamo is sort of unchanging. But in that 20 years that I've been at the Alamo, what I've been able to notice is this great blossoming of research that's taken place. And so we're talking about books, but we can also talk about things that are going to be on the agenda today, which would be areas of preservation. So there's a blossoming and interest in preservation. And you can even extend that to the idea of what is the Alamo going to be in the future? Not only the interpretation, but physically, what will the Alamo be? And again, I think that if we had not had 1986 and that period of questioning, we may not have gotten all of this. But we have, and I think it's turning out to be, like I said, really a golden age. People look back and be proud of everything that's being done right now. Thank you very much. I see the hook coming. I think you'll enjoy yourself today.